Would open your chat, I would love for you to say hello, introduce yourself, and let me just get my slides going as well. But say hello in the chat while I'm getting my slides up. That was also my test, so I can't see my chat really easily. So Samantha, if there's a comment in the chat that you want to give voice to, please do so as I'm talking. So, and I take it, I see some nods so everyone can hear me. So I'm really excited for this opportunity, and I'm taking a bit of an unusual approach, which is rather than tell you all the things I know and have learned about values and valuing and evaluation, which was the initial invitation, I'm going to tell you where I'm stuck, where my head is at now, what I'm wrestling with, and then invite you into some conversation around that to see what ideas are out there. We do have a mixed audience, so I know some people are really intimately have thought a lot about questions of value and evaluation, and some might be newer. As I said, I'm not going to go over a lot of foundational material, but I'm going to take you right into this question that I'm wrestling with. And actually, I found my chat, so let me see if I can. Now I've got that. Okay, great. Criteria. So are criteria the heart of evaluation? This is the question I'm going to focus on. And I'm going to start out by telling you why I think it's an important question. So these are the main 7 things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to get my clock as well. I think it'll be about a half an hour. So then we'll have some time for Q&A and discussion. A little bit about my background, my path, and why I care about this question. The main argument I'll make an invitation. And then I'm going to talk about 2 cases. One, which was one of the first evaluations I worked on ever when I was a graduate student. And then I'm going to talk about a case that I'm working on right now with collaborators at Boston College, and why I think each case illustrates a really different idea about what value means and what our role as evaluators in supporting value is. And then I'm going to leave it to you for discussion to see what ideas and input you have around this question of criteria and value and what that means for what we do as evaluators. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background on me, I grew up in the US. I moved 14 different times. Boston is place number 14. My dad worked for the railroad, so that was why we moved around a lot. So this is my little recognition of that in terms of these tracks. As an undergraduate, so I'm in my late 30s now, and when I was 19 and 20, doing my bachelor's degree, I went to a university called New College in Florida, and I could design my own thesis. And I focused on the social sciences. I did an interdisciplinary major, and I actually did a thesis about that. The question was literally doing good. And it was a critique of outcome-based evaluation used in the nonprofit sector in Florida way back when, almost 2 decades ago now. And I was really interested in this question of is evaluation making a difference? Is it doing good? I surveyed people and did some interviews with different nonprofit leaders about how they saw evaluation. Not going to talk about that now, except that it really turned me on to this question that there's not an answer. A lot of community-based nonprofits in the study that I did then were quite resistant to evaluation and found it hindered their mission and the work that they were trying to do. So you're going to see this as a recurring theme, and also as part of the backdrop of why I care about this question of criteria and value. I did my PhD at University of Illinois. Those of you that are familiar with University of Illinois, the place of responsive evaluation, then cultural responsive evaluation. Jennifer Green's work on values engagement in evaluation, and Tom Schwant's work on values and valuing as well. It was a place that I really got to learn a lot. I think I put in the description, like I grew up on the values branch, so to speak, of the evaluation theory tree. I had a lot of discussions around questions of value in my training and in my orientation, and got to put those into practice. And I'll share one example there. Then I did some training in systems thinking and systems approaches. You can see it's a little bit of a choppy background because I like to explore my interests. So I was getting familiar with systems training or systems thinking and how that interacted with questions of value. Then I worked in public health, and I did a postdoc at CDC where I really understood their model, which is depicted here, of evaluation focused on programs and that had different stakeholder involvement throughout the process. And then at Boston College, where I'm situated now as an assistant professor, I co-wrote a book with Tom Schwant that really looks at this question of value, both in social research and evaluation, and recently co-edited an issue on systems and complexity in evaluation. So this does not tell one story, but one of the threads throughout this story is this both optimism and skepticism I have about evaluation's role in relationship to social change, and this sort of self-interrogation around whether we're doing good as a field and how we would know that. So to get going, I actually want to go back and say, like, imagine if you had to define evaluation, right? What would you define? How would you describe evaluation? There have, been ongoing conversations about what evaluation is, what it isn't, how we define it. This is a quote or a description that I like, that has all the key elements in many of the definitions that are used. And some of the things here that I've highlighted is that, it's an applied inquiry process focused on data or evidence. So for collecting and synthesizing evidence that culminates in conclusions about the state of affairs, the value, merit, worth, significance, or quality of something. That thing could be a program, product, person, policy, proposal, plan, etc. And it's this value feature. So this evaluative process culminating in an evaluative judgment, that value feature that really distinguishes evaluation from research. So what do we mean by value, right? If that's at the core and the heart of evaluation, value, what do we mean by value? And my main argument and invitation is a distinction that Tom and I make in the book that we wrote between determine and develop. And what we argue, and what I'm going to further extend here, is that this distinction matters for both how we understand what evaluation is and then how we envision what our role and responsibilities are as evaluators. I'm going to have to go back to my teaching brain and ignore things. So we have construction going on in our house, and my dog is like defending our house with with all his might. But I'm just going to ignore that. Yeah. Okay. No, I can't. This part is not blurred, just so you know. So if you guys stay over there, I can't blur it now. It's too late. Sorry, everyone. This is real life. Okay. The contrast between determine and develop. So think a little bit in your mind, what's the difference for you? Determining something versus developing something. This is just from the Oxford Dictionary. So determine, ascertain or establish exactly, firmly decide or bring something to an end. So that would mean, if we put that together with value, determining, establishing exactly what the value of something is. Develop, grow or cause to grow and become more mature, advanced, or elaborate. So if we were developing value, how do we advance and elaborate on value? In an evaluation context, determining value then is really the core definition we have of evaluation, establishing value of an intervention based on criteria and evidence using evaluative reasoning. Answering questions like, how did we do? And then based on that, how do we improve? Develop, which Tom and I try to unpack and articulate some in the book. Developing value is really more about exploring value, the dimensions of value amidst a complex situation, diverse lines of evidence and perspective, but in order to further cultivate, right, to enhance, advance, or elaborate on value. And part of what's unique about developing value is this question of should we do next? What should we do next? Because we're interested in growing and supporting value creation and value development beyond just rendering a judgment or an assessment of value. Okay, so my invitation is that if we move into the space of developing value, criteria might not matter so much. They might not be so central. And I actually don't know the answer to that. I think that's an open question in the field at the moment. But I'm really wondering if we focus more on what value means than criteria and the dimensions of value that matter, whether or not they're articulated as criteria, will that take us into some new spaces? So now, rather than launch into the reasons for each of these things, like more theoretically, I want to talk about two cases and contrast them and lift up some points in them. And these are cases that are real. Let me just say it like that. They're real, they're juicy. The first one is the first evaluation I worked on when I was really understanding what does evaluation mean? What is evaluation from a responsive, stakeholder-driven view? So bear with me, I'll talk through this first case and then highlight some points from it. So again, I was at school in Illinois. I was a graduate student. It was my, I think, second year of graduate school. And Illinois is a place in the Midwest in the US that has a lot of coal. They mine coal for energy. This was a state-funded program and it was an educational program for teachers to educate teachers about the benefits of coal. That was in the legislature. That's what this resources were supposed to be allocated for. So it was a teacher professional development program and a curriculum focused on coal. In this image here, you see some groups that were protesting against the program. Part of why they wanted the evaluation is because the state agency was getting bad media, bad press about this program, and they wanted an evaluation to sort of just tell everybody about the benefits of this program, right? That was their initial thinking. And of course, that's not exactly what we were going to do, but that was the impetus for evaluation. Just to give you a sense of the controversy, yes, they had this little coal with a hat and some goggles, and there were multiple media articles about it. So one of these media articles is saying a grinning cartoon character in a hard hat and safety goggles, shaped like the state of Illinois and also evoking a lump of coal, touts how reclaimed coal mines let us, quote, balance our energy needs and our environmental needs. So what did we do as evaluators? We did what I was trained to do and what our orientation was, which was a combination of responsive and values engaged, which means we went there. So there's a old school picture of me, my mentor, Lizanne DeStefano, who directed a STEM Education Evaluation Center. We experienced the program, which means we went down into a coal mine. We talked with all different stakeholder groups about their perspective on the program. We collected different forms of data and evidence in relation to questions to assess the value. You know, our main purpose was to assess the value and quality of the program. And I'm showing these pictures slightly facetiously, right? Because this is clearly a politically loaded type of program, but the main frame we had was this responsive, stakeholder, values engaged orientation to our work. And in doing that, I had to articulate what the core criteria would be that we would use, because we wanted our evaluation to be seen as credible by different stakeholder groups. And so we really had to be clear and transparent about what the criteria were. After we did the evaluation, it culminated in this giant report, 400-page report. You can see this is some press about the evaluation. And towards the bottom of this quote, it quotes us, the evaluation, saying that, you know, our conclusion was to retire the curriculum and revamp it. And literally, the quote in the media article lifts up the main criteria we use to assess the quality of the program. High quality scientific content, a balance of perspective, and presenting coal within an energy portfolio in national and global context. Those were 3 of the 5 criteria we used to evaluate this program. And that led us to this evaluative conclusion that the current curriculum and program in their form were, you know, insufficient and of low quality against these criteria, and so they should revamp it. So after the press about the actual evaluation, there was, again, pushback from the same groups that had protested the program at the beginning. You can see this quote from somebody. We don't have time to tell this full story, but this person personally called me when I was a grad student, telling me a lot of things they thought about the program, sending me a copy of his book about how his family had been harmed by the coal mines in Southern Illinois. So a very passionate person about this issue, representing his community. And in his opinion piece in Huffington Post, he says that now we're going to revamp this curriculum and program, basically, that our evaluation has this lack of urgency that reflected the State Department's lack of urgency about the inadequacy of this program and really the harm the program had done over time, and that our main recommendation that the state program could improve was something that they contested. This idea that the program needed to improve at all. What they wanted was the program to be completely shut down and for the resources to be reallocated towards new ends or new purposes. So maybe not a classic program evaluation, but as I said, it was the first evaluation I worked on. It is an education program. We use the models of evaluation that are very well established. And I didn't say all the details there, but I'm using this to say, okay, so criteria supposedly matter. Now, like putting the critique and the pushback aside that we received, when I went to my mentor and as a team, we talked about, was this a good evaluation? I mean, I was like shaken, right? I didn't anticipate getting phone calls about how bad my work was when I really thought that I did good work. So like the question is, again, is evaluation doing good? What do we mean by quality? Why criteria matter? So in this case, I mean, I do think there's some support for why criteria matter. They're closely tied to this question of evaluation quality in terms of validity, credibility, and utility. So ensuring that the processes center on what really matters. We did not use the program goals. We did not use the program intended desired outcomes. We developed our own criteria through a stakeholder participatory process and then use those as the basis for our evaluation questions and evidence. We thought that that would help build the case for validity and also credibility. In terms of credibility in general, like when we have participatory input and we make the conclusion transparent, there's an assumption that evaluation then will be credible. In this case, some of the boundaries set around the evaluation made it so that the evaluation still wasn't credible. But again, in theory, the credibility would be supported by our use of criteria. And then yes, making the value base of the intervention to improve. Now, in this case, the argument was against improving at all. But yes, we actually did have recommendations through which the state agency and program could improve. So I'm being somewhat provocative. Was this a good evaluation? You might disagree with aspects of it altogether, but my stance right now is yes, based on what we intended to do, based on the evaluation models we used, and based on our centering these criteria through a stakeholder-driven process, it was supposed to be a high-quality evaluation. But clearly it didn't translate and wasn't received that way by the different audience. And so there's more at stake here around questions of value and criteria. I want to go into like a completely different kind of case and use that case, even though in this case, there are some nuggets as to why criteria might not matter, or why they might be insufficient to answer questions of value. I want to talk about a case that I'm currently involved in, which is making me again wrestle with this question of, are criteria so important, or are we missing something? Am I missing something by focusing on criteria? I'm just seeing, I don't see anything in the chat, and I think seeing most faces that people are with me. Okay, so let's switch gears, different case. And then, as I said, we will have a good amount of time for questions and discussion. Okay, so now fast forward over 12 years later, I'm now in the role of being a faculty member, and I'm co-PI on a project that has $1 million budget. Let me say that. I know this is being recorded. I should be careful what I emphasize here, but has $1 million evaluation budget from a nonprofit and industry partner group for an organization called CodePath, which is a national group that works on computer science education, access and opportunity for students from groups underrepresented and underserved in computer science and also in tech careers. And so it's really an initiative that focuses on access and opportunity and training throughout the undergraduate to professional trajectory type of experience. And I'm going to show you some more about that. This group put out a request for an evaluation partner. They did not have a specific evaluation scope. They wanted a research partner, ideally educational researchers and evaluators. And I'm going to I have a slide to show you a little bit about what they initially asked. So it wasn't so much like, we want you to evaluate our program, but rather we want a research and evaluation partner for these reasons. So based on the industry funding that they get from some of the big tech companies, they had been identified as a nonprofit that could make massive systemic change in the United States over the next 5 to 10 years in the areas of racial equity and economic mobility. So the work they were doing in computer science education, or they are doing, and also in pipelines and trajectories or pathways into technology careers, really could have influence on or impact systemically on racial equity and economic mobility. So based on this, they said they wanted a multi-year partner to build this quote unquote evidence of effectiveness. And I will say they had some other, this is again in the US, they have other educational researcher partners who helped them think about this initial scope, which they viewed as a very loose, open scope. But what they say here is that they want to develop the pathway to scale their work by building a body of rigorous experimental and quasi-experimental evidence. The goal of this partnership is to produce rigorous evidence that will help our, intermediate data infrastructure and support our learning to pursue the most impactful strategies for scale. So they wanted this evidence building, and they wanted it so that they could have a greater impact, over time and across more institutions. Again, given our time, I'm not going into a lot of depth, but it's several dozen universities that they partner with, and it's always in flux. So they have these giant university partnerships, and they reach a lot of students through them. They partner with universities and computer science programs to deliver basically courses online, as well as additional training in computer science. And they also have a whole bunch of career services to support students getting internships and opportunities in tech careers. So I don't know how many, goosebumps is not the right expression, but how this is rattling somebody or not in terms of those of you reading this. But I'm the only evaluation trained person on the team. All my co-PIs are trained as educational researchers. And so this kind of scope is right in line with what they assume evaluation is and does. We're here to build evidence. And of course, we would build the most rigorous evidence. And of course, rigor means experimental and quasi-experimental designs, right? That's their thinking. And in my thinking, I was like, oh, no, I think we need more actual evaluation, which for me meant evaluative reasoning, clear criteria, and then thinking about the diversity of evidence that might be needed to support, assessing value based on those criteria. So before I get into this, I'm not going to explain all of this. Let me do one more segue, which is that even though I told them what I just said, they said, that's not what this partner wants. Like, what do you want to do? What could you contribute that they might want? So this was the scope in our pitch as evaluators, and we won this bid to do the work. The main proposal is an experimental design-based study to look at a comparison between students, like their degree of exposure to different code path courses and their outcomes, and looking at degree of exposure, and then also ideally student groups at the same institutions that are not exposed to the intervention, right? That sort of design. And so what I ended up proposing was a theory of change co-development process, right? We bring different stakeholder groups together within the organization, outside the organization, to co-develop a theory of change. And in my pitch, I was making the argument that if they want to scale and know what to scale for impact, they would need to have a better understanding of how and why what it is they were doing was designed to produce or to contribute to the impact that they care about. So that piece stayed, and we were told we were the only ones that had a theory of change component. So it stayed and also helped us succeed in getting the funds to have this partnership. This is not the best theory of change visual. I have some manuscript out now about this development process, but it took us 7 months to develop this. And this isn't a talk about theory of change. I'm not going to go too far on it. I just want to make a couple points, which is just within this type of organization that is very much startup culture, learn quickly, adapt quickly, grow quickly, scale quickly, right? This kind of orientation. They care about data, they care about evidence, but they also move a lot faster than evidence building moves. And developing a cohesive framework that everybody agreed with, or that felt like their view and input was included, took 7 months to develop this theory of change. So I'm saying that. And then on the bottom, on the bottom part, you see a theory of change that's very programmatic. On the top, you see our initial ideas about what systemic change means and how this program would contribute to systemic impact. I think I do need to explain it a little bit to make the next point, but it reads left to right. So bottom left to top right, still pretty linear for those of you, again, who are in the complexity theory of change space. But bottom left, this initiative, CodePath, this organization partners with both employers and higher ed institutions with this idea of reaching and enrolling students who are Black, Latinx, Indigenous, coming from low SES backgrounds or other underserved groups. Then the bottom teal part is all about what they do programmatically and organizationally. So the buckets under 4A, they have these different services, and also the community surrounding the services that, as I said, support access in CS and tech. And then you have 4B, all these outcomes they would like to see, mostly for students, ultimately then this diversifies the tech workforce and builds generational wealth and power for BLI, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous and communities that are low SES to start with. On the top, I'm not going to be able to say much about that because it's a very preliminary ideas about how they would accomplish systemic impact over time as they reach and partner with more employers and more higher ed institutions. But my ed research collaborators, this is their focus. And this is what they still see as the primary feasible scope and contribution of our work, whether it's called ed research or called evaluation. We can look at things in this yellow box, like to what extent do they actually reach and enroll the targeted students? How could they do that better? To what extent do they have, to what extent are students engaging in the curriculum and securing the internships? What are those experiences like for students? And then on the right, what are the outcomes of students who go through these core educational activities? So it's like bringing a programmatic mindset to this aspect of what this organization does, and then really honing in on the things that we know that we can measure and that we could then report on in terms of data. And the thinking is that we could then help the organization get better at doing what they're doing. I'm saying it in this way because this, even though criteria are not centered, the criteria have to do with reach, have to do with student experience, and have to do with student outcomes. Those are the things embedded in the theory of change that matter. In my own work, I'm quite interested in this systemic impact question, and we might focus on that more in the project overall. But what I want to say for this talk is, repeatedly, I did say, I think we should develop some overarching evaluation criteria to help ground our work, to help ground like how we focus the evaluation, to help ground how we report, and also so that we're all aligned around what matters and we actually get that checked out from more perspectives besides the initial founders and the initial groups we worked with. And the argument for criteria that I was making wasn't working because it's embedded in the theory of change, it's embedded in what the project already does. And so it doesn't matter if we talk about reach and student experience and outcomes. Those are the things people care about, and like nothing else was emerging as mattering as much as those things. So it's like, from an ed research mindset, let's just study that empirically, and that's that. Why do we need to consider criteria more? So I'm not sure how well this works as a segue, but these are some of the things I'm wrestling with in terms of why criteria might not matter. And at first, and they are evident in this case, one could use these reasons to say evaluators should just make more persuasive cases for criteria, which some of you on the line might want to make that point, and I welcome that. But I did try, and I myself got unpersuaded the longer I tried. So clients, not evaluators, set the criteria. You know, the types of evidence they wanted, the lines of evidence they wanted evidence, what they wanted evidence about was very much preset. It didn't have much room for negotiation, and they wanted that to both show and increase the value of their work. And those things were really foundational in their work, and they hadn't had that evaluation or research happening already. From an evidence-based policy and practice perspective, I mean, initially they were still quite focused on this what works question, but then expanding to questions of what works for whom, how, and in what circumstances. But the perspective in that space is not that criteria have a lot to offer, but rather a good theory of change has something to offer. So theory of change, the overlay between theory of change and criteria, I think could be important, but the theory of change holds more value or more prominence than criteria in helping direct questions and direct lines of evidence building. So yeah, again, this is like, I'm not really sure, but the theory of change the theory of change was something that resonated much more than coming up with an evaluative criteria framework. There are other reasons based on my background in systems thinking and now systems change, a whole bunch of things that I'm struggling with in terms of why criteria might not matter really. And these are things that I haven't totally figured out, and I'm in conversation with different people around. I'm going to go through one of these at a time. So the first thing, and they do apply to CodePath as well, like if ultimately what we're trying to do is help people who are engaged in change in some space, learn and adapt into the future. So, that's quite different than a retrospective look at saying how well did we do, but rather that how should we do next? What should we do next? This sort of future orientation, I think, problematizes criteria. And for code paths, systemic change work, I mean, all they want to do is have evidence that helps them figure out what to do next, which is, I don't know, maybe more people are getting that question, but I feel sort of ill-equipped based on, like, criteria don't help us do that, and lines of evidence from ed research don't help us do that. That's, again, another point that I'll just put a pin in. My work in thinking on boundary critique. So boundaries actually set the conditions for criteria and what values count. So if we don't actually do robust boundary critique, it was particularly evident in the first Cole education program. If we don't critique the need for such a program at all, and not have on the table completely different boundaries about the ways the resources would be allocated or could or should be allocated, then criteria are still inside boundaries that are inside certain value perspectives. So it's like this point about the interplay between boundaries and value, I think, raise questions about the relevance and the importance of criteria. Work on contribution versus attribution. There's a lot of stuff on redefining impact and all these different ways of thinking about impact, even though impact is kind of like value, and some of the different types of impact are different types of criteria. But again, I don't see them as being so much about criteria and the way they're being talked about, but rather the way we think about impact. The other point with contribution and attribution is that contribution raises a whole nother sets of questions about the relationship between interventions to other interventions and context, which I'm not sure that criteria deal with well enough. Whether there should be new criteria. So some people in this space, like Patton has a piece on transformational criteria. Rebecca Teasdale has been expanding ideas of criteria in informal science learning, right? So some people are saying it's not, that we get rid of criteria, but we just need new ones. Work on participatory evaluative rubrics, so value for money. I know Julian's on the line. These don't neatly fit here, but again, it's work on making criteria more explicit and evaluative reasoning much more explicit. And why I put those two pieces, participatory evaluative rubrics and value for money, here is that they're really good examples of how they're fitting complex circumstances. So they're actually getting adapted to make sense within complexity well. But I'm not sure that, again, that the criteria is really the heart. I think in some of those, the value piece is the heart. And then lastly, frameworks for systems change. So in my work now, I've been reviewing frameworks. There's a lot coming out, over 24 guides already in the last 2 years on system change and systemic change or systemic impact. And people are starting to evaluate using those frameworks. It's not that they're developing new criteria to evaluate based on those frameworks, but rather the frameworks themselves become the guiding orientation to doing evaluation and learning work. So again, I don't know how well this comes off in a brown bag, but this is where my head is at. I'm really struggling or going back and forth between these ideas of determine and develop, and whether our focus historically and definitionally on determining value and then saying we have to just do a better job at identifying the criteria. I'm not sure that's sufficient for the context that we work in now. I think it tends to be more retrospective in the types of questions we're asking and answering, more narrow in the types of evidence we consider, and whether this notion of developing value is really worth tapping into more, whether it can open up more ways for evaluation and evaluators to contribute, particularly in complex spaces and around system change initiatives. I also think developing value opens up new lines of methods, like from the future and foresight spaces are just some examples that are getting more attention. But I'm still wrestling with the idea of developing value. Like, what do we orient our evaluative process around then? Which is why I gave that theory of change example. Are we building and testing theories of change? Or what are sort of the frameworks then that bring the evaluative priorities and lines of inquiry together in some sort of cohesive way? So thank you for your attention. I'm gonna turn my slides off and welcome some Q&A and discussion.
Okay, and Emily, we did have one question in the Q&A already, and just a reminder, you can come off mute, raise your hand, put it in the chat, the Q&A, whatever works best for you. But Joanna is wondering about the stakeholder consultation process in the COLE program evaluation. So wondering more about how did you go about finding all the stakeholders? Do you feel like you missed anyone? And I think that was in particular to, you know, the person that was pretty upset about it. Like if he had been included, might that have helped?
Thanks. That's a really good question. And the way I'm going to answer it is so yes, we did talk to this person. And we spent some time figuring out all the different groups. So we had this was also outside of Chicago because it was in Illinois. So we had residents groups who were harmed by the pollution due to coal mining. Like we had, I don't even know, about a dozen different stakeholder groups. At the same time, absolutely, we excluded people. There was no way we could have accounted for all the different groups and interests. But my point in highlighting the dissent or the backlash is that I think this idea of responsiveness to different stakeholder interests and then inclusion somehow creating alignment around what matters and what value means, it's just not possible. There were stakeholder groups that were completely politically on different sides of this issue, and there was a limit to how much deliberation we could facilitate as evaluators. And we focused our process on identifying a cohesive set of criteria to guide the evaluation. We did not say, we will not do this evaluation. Instead, we're just going to say, shut down the program, which was the, not just the sentiment, it was the request from some of the ongoing activists in the space. Let me find your chat. I think you responded, but I couldn't see it. Let's see. Oh yeah. Yeah, he in particular was included, but I think, so again, I'm not sure if this is coming off well, but I just think that there are issues that are, it's not possible. Yeah, I can't make this point quickly, but evaluation can't serve a democratically deliberative place. We can try, we can aspire to, but we still saw our evaluative task as setting the criteria and then gathering data to assess this intervention. And that is going to presume one understanding of what the program is about or several understandings, but there's a limit to that. And the core issue that was getting debated about whether or not coal should be considered an energy source and whether or not we should educate teachers about coal within an energy portfolio are things that people, actively debate about. They debate the science and the politics so I'm just trying to push back on saying I'm not sure that even had we done even more extensive inclusion, that would have alleviated it. Yeah, Corey.
I have a question in the room. Yeah, my name is John. My question is, can you, you were talking about criteria, but if you can differentiate, if you are making mention of evaluation criteria or judgment criteria, because with the evaluation criteria of OECD DAG, they have outlined a lot of areas. And also the judgment criteria, which Michael Scriven spoke about, leads to the evaluative conclusion. So I just wanted to make, if you can differentiate which criteria you are trying to emphasize.
So I see those as one and the same, and let me see if I can quickly go to a slide. I think I have some towards the back here, otherwise I'll just answer you. Okay, so let me just do this because I know. So in the foundational logic of evaluation, right, Scriven's, developed, yes, the first step, you establish the criteria of merit or the criteria that define what success or quality means. And then those become the criteria that are the basis in developing the evaluative judgment, right? You could also develop standards. Then in step 3, you're identifying the data to then assess performance in relation to the criteria. So those criteria inform the judgment. And these are examples of criteria. So yes, the OECD DAC criteria could be those criteria. Any of these are also criteria. This is from a chapter by Schwant. But I'm just talking about any dimensions of quality, value, or success that then become the basis for what you gather evidence on, which then informs the basis of the type of judgment you might render as evaluators. From, again, all from a conventional way of thinking about evaluation as rendering judgment on value or determining value.
I'm gonna just like say some things, and there might be a question in there, but I've been thinking a lot about this, especially in the context that I work in the context of healthcare, and we've been thinking a lot and over the last 6 months and are continuing into next year to try to really unpack the notion of value of health equity investments made by healthcare systems, right? And so we believe it's important to be able to do this because it's how we think we'll be able to sustain this work in the long term as various pressures push on a system that ultimately has to make money. And we want to expand the notion of value in a context where value, like when you were given the example in your theory of change, like of the ed researcher colleagues, like I was thinking about my colleagues who really just want to see the financial ROI. Like their version of like what those ed researchers were doing was like, we just want to see the financial ROI and short-term impacts on individuals rather than broader structural changes that might have longer-term impacts on communities, right? For example. So like they're not in a mindset where they can think about the value of the investments we make at those next levels that were in your theory of change. You know, complicating that is like the notion of value-based care, and I've been thinking a lot about how healthcare really needs evaluators right now because they're grappling with this concept of value-based care and what that should mean. Like, how does healthcare shift from a structure where it was just about volume to a place where it's all about outcomes, right? And so like all of these things like have been swirling around in my head, and at the same time we've been trying to think about how do we use criteria and how do we use the figure that's in you and Tom's book of you bringing perspectives into conversation with evidence to answer questions and using rubrics and criteria to engage people in dialogue about evidence to bring those perspectives into conversation so that they can answer the questions, right? Not necessarily us, but them. So there's a lot in there, but like I just like it's all been kind of swirling around in my head, and so I just wanted to kind of put it out there for your comments.
Thank you. So Corey, this might be frustrating, but I'm gonna just keep going because Julian offered to connect with you and he's got ideas about value creation and theory of change. I want to defer and see if Tom has something, and then maybe Julian can share in relation to the group, because part of my vulnerability, I mean, like, this is where I'm at in my thinking is like, because I know other people are at different places and I want to learn too. Yeah.
Thanks, Emily. I just want to follow up on Corey's point and connect it to your two examples. I think there seems to be two dimensions that evaluators have to pay much more attention to in deciding what they're about and how they're going to go about doing what they're doing. One is clearly, to what extent is there a blend between not just evaluating the effectiveness of a program, or in this case, a program, all right, but also focusing on systemic change. And as you said, there's lots of frameworks for that, but there's a kind of assessment that has to go on early on in an evaluation to say, is there some blend of these two kinds of things going on, or is it really one or the other? That's one dimension, right? And I think the second dimension that's implicit in what your cases were is to what extent is the client, so to speak, whoever's responsible for what is going on there, totally focused on action orientation and moving fast, moving along, get this strategy in place, let's go, all right? Versus, no, we're going to pile up the evidence before we make any decisions. Those are two dimensions that I think have a lot to do with the extent to which criteria are prominent and relevant and so on and so forth, that we have to pay much more attention to, it seems to me. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. I'm looking at comments in here. I know there was another question. Yeah, this client idea, which Donna's raising and was in your question, Tom, as well. Yeah, Julian, do you want to offer some?
Yeah, hi, Emily. Hi, Tom. Great to see you all. I love it when our time zones line up like this and we can attend your presentations. Thanks very much for this. I was just thinking about Corey's question particularly, but also your question, Emily, about do we always need criteria? And I think for one thing, it depends on what the question is that we're addressing. So for background, I'm doing a lot of work in the evaluation capability building space, and especially around value for money. And when we work with stakeholders to identify some key evaluation questions, it seems to often come down to three recurring things. And so there's a question, a generative theory building type question that says something like, to whom is the program valuable? In what ways is it valuable? And how does it create value? So how does the program create value? Through what mechanisms is it turning resources into significant social value? Secondly, there's a summative question that just says something like, to what extent does it provide good value for the resources invested? And then there may be a formative question that says, how can we get more value from the resources invested? So it's not always those three, but it seems to often come down to some version of those. And for that first one, for the theory building question, we don't need criteria. But the answer to that question helps us to develop criteria that we can use to help us answer the summative and formative questions. And it seems that when we start thinking in terms of value rather than just change, it seems to sometimes add extra thinking into a theory of change, at least some of the time. So in some sense, perhaps building that idea of value creation into a theory of change is almost sneaking criteria in there. At least it's helping to build a bridge from the theory to the criteria. It's not such a leap to get to the criteria. So yeah, Corey, I'd be happy to discuss that some more, and I've got some examples I can share.
Julian, I would love to hear that too. I have a quick response, which is just like, it took us 7 months to co-develop this theory of change. And to the client question too, this was with a dozen people who worked in different roles in the organization, who each had teams of between 5 and 100 people globally, right? So it was like we only worked with the inner circle of founders and lead staff, and it took us 7 months to come up with some shared understanding about how all the things they're doing fit together from a change perspective. So part of like my open curiosity and ongoing question then is like, when you really center value creation alongside or instead of change, the extent to which and the pluralism, right, that you would have to engage, like I'm just like wrestling with how do you do that in a practically feasible way. Yeah, I don't know if you have any response to that, Julian, because
yeah, that's something we've been grappling with too, because this is such a new idea. We've been, I could guess you call it, innovating with it in a few projects over the last few years, you know, so we're learning something every time we do it. But it seems to boil down to a few key questions, and it can almost be it doesn't have to be a huge, complicated addition to a theory of change. It can be as simple as answering a few questions, which could be a narrative alongside the theory of change, or could be just a few extra, could be an extra column on the theory of change. And often it helps us to take the helicopter up a few thousand feet and see something from a broader level. So we'd be answering questions like, to whom is the investment or the policy or the program? To whom is it valuable, and in what ways? Just being able to have a conversation to articulate that brings new things to the surface. And then what kinds of resources are invested? Because I'm always in my work, I'm pushing to think about not just value for money, but value for all the resources that get invested in a program, the intangibles that sometimes sit below the surface and aren't talked about. And third, how does the investment create value? How is it transforming resources into something more valuable? And then fourthly, kind of a barriers and enablers question almost, but we're thinking what factors influence whether it's going to create a lot of value or a little, because then that's getting us to think about those critical observable things that we can look at in the here and now that tell us whether we're on a pathway to create value in the longer term, which could have an awful lot in common, I think, with those yellow boxes that you showed on your theory of change, where it focuses down to what are the things we can see right now, but it's connecting them conceptually to a valuable future, in a sense.
Thanks, Julian. I know we're at time, and that does give me some places to go. I think I'm still sitting with the disagreement and political nature of some idea of value co-creation. Like, how do we handle that? Because that's what the first case illustrated. And the second case, to be honest, or to be transparent, it's like, this is industry backing a nonprofit. There are aspects of the work that are happening at rates that are fast, that will happen regardless, because of the inherent power that exists as the backdrop to that organization. So I'm just questioning, like, even in this value creation space, like, how we deal with issues of major power imbalance and politics, I think, are other open things for me that I'm not sure how to navigate. Yeah. So thank you, everyone, for being here. I see people from different places. I'm always happy to connect one-on-one, so feel free to send a note or an email. I know I want to respect our time. I think we've got a couple minutes, and Samantha, I know you had a couple closing points. I can't, oh, there you are. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. That was a great presentation, and thank you everybody that joined us and all of the participation. You can find a link to register for our Eval Cafe mailing list. I just put that in the chat. So if you want to stay in the loop, we will have our spring announcement coming up. We do have one more left for our fall presentations. So our next Eval Cafe will be Wednesday, December 6th. Hopefully you can join us. It's going to be a presentation with editors from JMDE. It's going to focus on decolonizing the JMDE publication process. So hopefully you'll be able to join us and participate in that. And thank you again, everybody. I hope you have a great day.